Hi, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. And the reason that I'm here is actually because I'm visiting Shirley Graham, because currently working on the Lee Tracy fossils. And of course, Shirley is a world-renowned specialist on the Lee Tracy. So I'm very, very lucky that she is having us, and especially also thanks to the garden director, Jordan Thijscher, for allowing me to be here. And yeah, of course, this garden and all the people here, the people who've been working here for years, are famous. So that makes it an extra thrill, and some of the most famous work that is published in the Missouri Botanical, what's called the Annals. So yeah, so I'm very happy to be here and also to get to know St. Louis. The talk that I'm presenting today is an extended version of the opening talk that I did at the International Palynological Conference earlier this year in May in Prague. And I framed it in the context of what's going on now in the Amazon. Of course, everybody knows it from the almost daily news about the drought in the Amazon and the fires, and that Amazon is under threat. And like my colleague here, Carmen Ulloa, and we are part of the science panel for the Amazon, which is a network that was created just at the beginning of COVID times to generate awareness of the situation in the Amazon, but also to bring scientists together, and also the incoming president of the Missouri Botanical Garden. She's also part of this network. So we've all been working together since that time, since the beginning of, well, it was 2020 really, that we should have met in Bogota, but of course COVID struck and we couldn't go. But through those years of COVID, we formed a strong bond with the whole network and put together this assessment report. And the science panel not only does assessment report, one of the most important tasks is to write briefings, to communicate, for instance, at meetings such as the COP, to generate consciousness that really this tipping point that is so much talked about is there. So that's why I want also to frame it in this context, like what's happening in the Amazon, but also what do we know about its past? Where do we come from? And where is it going now? And especially my role is to reflect on what do we know about the past. And of course, the Amazon is known as one of the most species-rich areas in the world. And I also want to highlight here the important role of the Andes in shaping the Amazon and also in creating this biodiversity. So the way that people have thought about the origins of biodiversity has changed over time, and I think at least since a decade, people are also more aware that geological history has played an important role in generating the geodiversity, but also the biodiversity that is associated with this. Of course, when you look at this map, and specifically at the map of South America, if you zoom in there, you can see this high diversity along the northern Andes and in the Amazon. And this Andes the history of the Andes plays an important role. So I want to reflect on that. And so also a bit disentangle which are the different players in this geological history that have shaped this huge diversity. So what geological, hydrological and climatic factors have played a role in shaping the Amazon? And also what is the role of connectivity? Because a lot of this, a lot is talked about connectivity. So what does that mean in terms of the fluvial systems, of the atmospheric patterns, and how does that play a role? Yeah. So of course we know about the waterways of the Amazon River, the big Amazon drainage basin, being this big catchment that is sort of lifeline across the Amazon. Look to the artery across the Amazon that connects the Andes with the Amazon. And you see also on the far right the connection it has with the ocean. So, of course, it's a big contributor of water. 1/5 of the fresh water is brought into the ocean by the Amazon. And it also, again, this role of the Andes plays a role there, as I hope to explain to you later on. Then there's also this connectivity, these flying rivers that I talked about, which is the connectivity from east to west. So these are the atmospheric patterns. It's the intertropical convergence zone that brings masses of humid air. But it's also important to realize that there is this this evaporation, this role of the forest in bringing in and contributing to these flying rivers, and I hope to activate this. This is something that is produced by colleagues, climatologists, that show this evaporation, evapotranspiration, that maintains this hydrological cycle, and that's very important. So we have this west to east connectivity and this east to west connectivity, which is especially the latter, is very important for the regional climate. And of course, that is why the forest plays a role on climate, and also regional climate will change if the forest is disappearing. So looking into the past, how did we get to this east-west, west-east system? And so there's different geological players that I want to highlight. In the first place, the history of the Andes. So the Andean mountains have formed over time, and actually it's, in geological sense, relatively recent. It starts about 80 million years ago, which seems long ago, but on the total history of the Amazon and the Amazon rocks, which goes for almost 4 billion years, well, 3.5, that's a short time. And so this uplift started in southern South America, and in the later part of this geological history, in the last, say, 30 million years, it was when the northern Andes was shaped, and particularly the last 10 to 20 million years. So this is a recent phenomenon, geologically speaking. Then we have, and I forgot what is the point, yeah, here. Then we have another phenomenon, which is the plate mantle interaction. So we have, of course, this very active margin that has created this conditions for the Andes to uplift. So this active margin, the subduction zone, and the Nazca plate diving underneath the South American plate. But this plate, when it interacts with the mantle, with the deep subsurface, it also generates a kind of a pool, a subsidence. And this is all in the realm of what geophysicists work on. But it's important also to understand movements of the Earth's surface. And so this pull down that's generated by the plate mantle interaction causes a subsidence that has generated very special conditions in the Amazon. So more about that later. And then, of course, we have global climate change. So we have had a history with many different stages. We have had ice house, snow world, ice house world in the deep past, in the Paleozoic. But we have also had long periods of greenhouse world. And so what did it look like then? And even this greenhouse world, some of it has occurred still in the more recent geological past, like until 50 million years ago, with peaks that can be seen here. And global climate change and sea level are usually linked. So in periods of global warming, you have high sea level, and when you have global cooling, when the water gets frozen and you have the polar caps, that is when you have global sea level, low global sea level, and that affects anything that happens on land. So those factors all play a role. This is just a little summary figure about the history of the Andes, which can be handy also for biogeographic reconstructions to realize when these different phases of Andean uplift occurred. I'm not sure if this pointer is still. Oh, I was keeping my finger in front of it, sorry. So this is produced by Lydia Bosman, who did a revision of the literature, and based on this, she produced these maps. This uplift of the Andes not only is creating a barrier that can be relevant for dispersal, create vicariance, it's also an orographic barrier. So by getting this orographic barrier, it also forms a barrier for the humid atmospheric patterns, such as this intertropical convergence zone that I showed previously, and this what also is this part of this east-west connectivity of the atmospheric masses. So you get increased precipitation in the Amazon due to the uplift of the northern Andes. And so that's why it plays an important role. Aside from this vicariant factor, it's also a climatic factor. So then I want to go a little bit into what has happened during the geological history with these factors playing a role. And I would like to highlight this very famous paper by Alwyn Gentry from 1982, who already was considering these important roles of climate, but also the Andes. And he wonders whether the neotropical forestic diversity has so the phytogeographical connections between Central and South America, Pleistocene climatic fluctuations, or an accident of the Andean orogeny. I would like to say now, I think it's both. It's not one or the other, and I think that has been a sort of thing that has been problematic in the scientific debate about the Amazon in past years, especially in the 80s, when there was a very strong focus on the Quaternary as being explanatory for the diversity in the Amazon, and especially this role of the Andes and what it means for generating soil surfaces that promote enriched flora. That's important. That's already in this title. So I think it's important to think of that. So going deep into the past, I would like to highlight the work by Monica Carvalho, who has studied the paleobotanical record and made this recopilation considering at the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary 66 million years ago. What is happening? Since when do we have the present forest, and what is it like in the Cretaceous, in this greenhouse world that still persists into the Paleogene? Of course, the KT boundary is famous for the impact of the meteorite and the extinction of the dinosaurs, but it also had an impact on the forest. And so through her work, we know, for instance, that the Cretaceous was characterized by an open canopy forest with little resemblance to the modern flora. And it was rich in gymnosperms. And then in the Paleocene, from just after this impact boundary, we get a closed canopy forest. Angiosperm composition resembles the modern flora. So that is sort of like where although it's very different still from the present, that's sort of where the basis for the modern rich tropical flora, and especially South American tropical flora, lies. There is not that much record, so we're very poor in fossil records, and especially on land there is lots of hiatuses, lack in the deposits that are preserved. To be able to reconstruct the history, you need the sediments that represent time to be preserved. But on land, you are very restricted. You have snippets of time preserved. So our reconstruction of the history is based on those snippets of time that give us that insight, which depend on, for pollen and spores that I work with, you need anoxic conditions to preserve the sediment. And so usually we find that in lacustrine deposits or in river floodplains. And then based on those samples, we can reconstruct what type of vegetation existed. So these pictures are from pollen types, Maritine palm and some Grevioideae that were found in the early Miocene sediments along the Caquetá River in the Colombian Amazon. And we know at that time there was a fluvial system that was born in the Amazon itself, and that it had a flora that was very much dominated by flora that we know from the eastern Amazon, cratonic type of flora. And it had already a lot of components, a lot of families that we know from the present flora were there, but also a lot were absent. And for instance, the famous Cecropia forest that we know along the Amazon River and many rivers, they were not there yet. They came much later. So it was a different flora. And it was flora that was more tolerant on nutrient poor soils. That's what we have from that time. And so how do we go about that? This is typically the kind of outcrops that we can get data from. This is 60 meters of outcrop where you see nice black clays. And we have, this is sort of how the sampling goes. So you take samples either every 10, 20 centimeters, and then we process that in the lab. And ultimately, how we reconstruct our vegetation is by looking at all these different components, and this can be hundreds and many hundreds of different types, with some of them being dominant, and that's often the palms. Interesting in this section, and that is also a theme in the Amazon history, is the influence of marine incursions. So there were phases where saline marine waters reached the Amazon, and we know this because there were organisms, plants and fauna, microfauna, that left traces that tell us there were at times mangroves. This is pollen of mangrove, and sometimes dinoflagellates and other unicellular organisms like foraminifera. And so that's also an important aspect of the Amazon history. Then, so we have this, we move from these fluvial deposits, we move into a lacustrine system that you can see here on this map that's generated by Lydian Bosman. We see here this blue, that's this freshwater system. And the interesting thing about this system is that it was super extensive. It was more than 1 million square kilometers, we think, and it occurs across the Amazon, across the western Amazon, I should say. We find it in Brazil under the name of the Solimoes Formation, in Peru under Peibas Formation, in Colombia it's called the Lower Amazon Formation. It also occurs in Ecuador as Curaray. And it represents a very unique system. We know on relative dating, and with pollen and spores, we can provide relative ages that we hear about. We moved from the early Miocene to the middle Miocene. Sorry. And that we have a completely different system than this fluvial system I started speaking about. This is a lacustrine system with some fluvial input from the Andes, and we know that because of the sediment composition. We also can tell because of the composition of pollen and spores. We see that there is pollen and spores that are indicative for already an elevational gradient and even an initial proto-paramal vegetation. So all that gets transported into the Amazon, but we also have still fluvial influx from the craton itself. And then you can see they have beautiful turquoise colors, and we see levels that are very rich in fossils. You can see vertebrae here, and it accumulates lots of different kinds of fossils. These can be reptilians, can be birds, and it has a wonderful mollusk fauna. Mollusk and ostracot, these are small crustaceans. And even macrofossils, Purosaurus, especially in the later, younger deposits. And these are some of these foraminifera that I talked earlier about that are indicative of marine or marine influence. And again, of course, the pollen help us understand the composition of this system. I would like to highlight that the mollusk and ostracot fauna is very well preserved, and it shows us an ecosystem that no longer exists. There's no good analog for this system, but we know it was this system when it initiated. It was receiving immigrants that arrived from the seas, from North America. The ostracots are known to have come from North America. They got into this system and then had a chance to diversify in the most incredible way. And so Frank Wesseling and Marines Ramos, also Fernando Munoz, they studied this system, and Frank Wesseling particularly did a fabulous job in bringing to life this amazing fauna that is very well preserved. It looks like they are, if you walk at some of the riversides in the Amazon, it's almost like a beach. So that is definitely a feature of this fluvial lacustrine system. Another very special feature of it is, and you saw them of course already, these reptilians. And Rodolfo Salas Gismondi from Peru, he has especially studied these reptilians, and here you see again a sort of recreation of the geography of this system, and he has studied extensively the reptilians and has shown that there was a very high diversity, much higher diversity in reptilians than we find nowadays. And yeah, so these organisms, of course, I was talking about the mollusks. So these reptilians, some of them were feeding, on mammals that were around at the time, but others were adapted to feed on these mollusks because they were, of course, plentiful in this system. And but when you look at this map, you see the disappearance of this system. So we think that about in the late Miocene, around 12 million years, this system gets into, it disappears, it dries up, and we get into the sort of precursor of the Amazon River. And I mentioned early on this work by geophysicists who had shown this special pool and this plate-mantle interaction. And what they have proposed, and it looks like this is what generates this unique system, this special pool created conditions where we have preservation of the deposits and a system that existed for, well, we think about maybe 6 million years, maybe 6 to 9 million years, this system existed where all this fauna developed. And so at some point in time, this geophysical phenomenon sort of migrated further. It ceased to generate this pool, and that meant that basically the architecture of the sedimentary basin changed in such a way that there was no chance for the system to persist, and instead it transformed into a river system. That was the precursor, as I said, of the Amazon, and at some point it connected with the fluvial system that we had on this eastern side of the Amazon. But coming back on these mollusks, so we had the reptilians. So we had reptilians, very, very diverse, that have been sort of recreated here in these sort of images, showing what life was at the time. A little bit more on these marine incursions. So here in this map, you can see different locations where there is evidence for marine influence. And so we know from putting this all together that in the Miocene there would have been a northward connection with the Caribbean, and that species probably entered this system from the north. Maybe there was a western connection, but that's not proven. So we know that there is definitely proof for the northern connection, and so it was it's clear that this freshwater system had phases where it was more influenced by marine, not properly marine conditions, but there was evidence for strong marine influence. And this coincides with the time, of course, we are in the Middle Miocene. This is a time of global warming and also high sea level. So this down warping of the system, the low topography in Amazonia, plus the high sea level, that all generated these conditions that made it possible for this Western Amazon that nowadays is the heartland of the continent, that at the time it was a coastal, it could harbor coastal conditions. And what are these organisms? So here an example of the foraminifer linings. This is what we find as part of the organic matter when we study the pollen and spores. Also the mollusks show that there was episodic change from freshwater assemblages to more coastal assemblages. And these phases lasted for several hundred thousands of years, and then it would again become a fully freshwater system. And well, right now, the research that I'm doing together with Shirley and also with other people and at the Field Museum is look further into the composition of the mangroves that existed at the time, to better understand what was the biogeography of these mangroves and what was their composition. So we're looking more at their composition, at the different pollen types, to understand that. And there's one of the locations that is very rich in mangroves where we find meters of sediments with mangrove pollen is here in the lower Upper Porus near the Brazilian border. Upper Porus is a tributary to the Yapurá River, Caquetá River, and there are some very good outcrops where we sampled this. A little bit more on the PEBA system, on the particularities. Over the years, we've been getting a better understanding of how this system worked, and also through the work of Hubert von Hoff, who has looked at the cyclicity of the sediments. We know that this was a cyclic system, so this lacustrine system was there would be like, periodic repeat of conditions. So we would have, for instance, this high base level where there was marine influence. Then the system would fill up, become more freshwater, and then this would be repeating itself. So we can see that through this cyclicity in the lithology, and especially in this granulometry, which is what geologists look at. But we also see this repeated in the mollusk, and we also see it in palynological cycles, where we see a change from and I think this is what it looks like when you look under the microscope. So you have here, for instance, a bundle of Rhizophora, which in the fossil records called Zonocostitis. But these are mangrove pollen clustered. And here we see, for instance, ferns. So we go from what is called a flood phase, where we have this invasion of the sea, by way of speaking, and then a withdrawal of the sea, where we get more swampy, marshy conditions with ferns and palms and a more terrestrial freshwater system. And so when we reconstruct this, and this was work together with Bob Morley, who thought deeply over these cycles together with us, and so here we represent like what did the vegetation, how did it respond to these cyclic changes. And this is where for instance, we have the high sea level, storm wave base, we have extension of the mangroves. Then there would be a regression where we get this filling up, freshwater conditions, further extension of the forest and freshwater plants, and then again the cycle would repeat itself. So that is how we envision this system changed over time. And why do we have the cyclicity? Well, that's driven by what's called Milankovitch cycles. These are astronomical cyclicities that can be repeating over 20, 40, and 100,000 years, depending on the tilt of the Earth and the rotation and so on. And so we think that this system in the Western Amazon was controlled by astronomical cyclicity. And so it controlled the abiotic conditions and therefore also the biotic composition. So this is a little bit of sort of artistic impression of the system. So here you see what we think the Western Amazon looked like in the Miocene. So the blue is this freshwater system that would occasionally be influenced by this marine influence from the Caribbean. And we think also that it had an important role it played an important role in the biogeography, because it allowed taxa to colonize this system, and some taxa, especially aquatic taxa, would profit from this. At the same time, those taxa that are land-bound, full forest organisms like the primates, they would be their area of existence would be more limited. And so this, of course, changed across time, but overall, the aquatic taxa profited, the terrestrial taxa less, and they were favored by the disappearance of the system, but there were also taxa that were able to live at the interface, and taxa that adapted. For instance, the dolphin, the pink dolphin, the Inia, they are a group, and they are just an example of organisms that that came into the system, adapted, and their ancestor at sea got extinct, but they were adapted and lived on. And that's, I think, an illustration. I think also there's a lot that we don't know yet about the marine influence. Probably also in the plant record, they will have left an imprint of taxa that were associated and adapted to fully freshwater conditions, or at this interface. So that was an impression that we created a number of years ago when we did a book about the Amazon. And so now I would like to move on into this evolution of the Amazon viewed through the eyes of a geologist. And so we moved from this, we just had this PEBA system, and we think, of course, this is reconstruction based on data available. There's a lot that we don't know because simply there's gaps in time, but we do know that at the Atlantic, the Amazon River, of course, that connects the Andes with the Atlantic, it leaves a trace. And the Amazon, in that sense, is a very good producer of leaving a historical trace. And also, coastal and marine records tend to be much more complete than terrestrial records. So we have, when we look at the coastal area where the Amazon arrives, and there we look through the work of the oil and gas explorers. Typically, the oil and the hydrocarbon industry, they drill wells, and they drill wells in the Amazon fan, and they have drilled a lot in the Guyana shelf, coastal shelf. These are areas that are known to have high potential for hydrocarbon, and so they drill into the subsurface, and by drilling, they explore, but they also produce a record of the rocks they drill through. So it is thanks to those cores, wells, they produce not exactly cores. It's not our ideal scientific material, but by every 3 meters that they drill, they will have evidence of that's kept, and that's material that we can work with and look through time into the historical record, for instance, of the Amazon River, but also of the Guyana coast. So So when we look at the coastline, and by looking at the records that there are from seismic studies and extensive studies that they have done on the coastal area, we know that there is a record from there is a record from the late Cretaceous onwards here in this coastal region, and we know from these records that there was an initial proto-Amazon that was only draining the eastern Amazon. So we had the proto-Amazon here in the west, and we had the proto-Amazon here in the east. And this system existed for a long time. And this system was fed by this proto-Amazon initially. But at some point, the Andes and the Atlantic were connected through what is the transcontinental Amazon. So I'd like to show you a little bit about what we know of the Amazon River by looking at these sediment records that we have from the Atlantic, and also what that means, because of course we have a big change from this lacustrine system and then to this transcontinental Amazon that is so important. That's a divider that has played a tremendous role in diversification, also later on, for instance, for the birds, but also for many other organisms. It's a very big change, very big geographic change that's taking place. Based on the work with Petrobras geologists and by using the records that they made available to us, we could look at the sediment composition. So we know from these records that we chose to look at the entire Neogene, which starts at 23 million years ago. And so we looked at sediments, and the Brazilian geochronologists from the Universidade de Brasilia, they did this work, this specific work, and they showed us that up to 9 to 9.4 million years, we had a predominantly cratonic Eastern Amazon sediment source. So we know that was this proto-Amazon that was only draining the Eastern Amazon. But that from that time on, we get sediments that are born in the Andes. So we know that from that moment on, the Andes was feeding the system, and that these two proto-Amazons had connected and formed this one big river. And not only could we tell that from the sediment, but also the pollen record, the pollen and spores, they act as sediment particles. They give us an insight on local conditions, but they can also show us something about regional conditions. And so we know that we get pollen from the elevational gradient in the Andes that get transported to the mouth of the Amazon, in the Amazon fen, this dustbin, this trash can that it represents really for the continent. So it starts showing us a lot of grasses, and it shows us mountain taxa that we know can only come from this Andes. And we know that the Andes at that time already was a significant orographic barrier, had an important elevational gradient. So that's one thing that we learned. The other thing is that we looked at pollen and spores. The postdocs that were working with me, Giovanni Bogota looked at the pollen and spores, and Emmy Lammertsma, she looked at the dinoflagellates, these algae that are of photosynthetic algae. And there were algae also that left a calcareous skeleton. And so when we look through time, so we have this gray line, and that represents the onset of the connection between the Andes and the Atlantic. We also know from the organic and the inorganic material together that at that time we have high terrigenous input, but also we get a change in the way that algae feed. So we had at the initial part, we had what's called oligotrophic algae that feed on nutrient poor waters, and that after this change, this connection, we get what are heterotrophic algae that feed on much more nutrient rich waters, which is what the Amazon River meant. Amazon River waters are very nutrient rich. They transport sediment from the Andes that is continuously eroded, so it's very nutrient rich, whereas the eastern Amazon is very nutrient poor. Soils don't get eroded very fast, so that's also why we have this east-west divide on land from say relatively species poor eastern Amazon to much more species rich eastern Amazon. And so we see the same pattern at sea. We see this change from nutrient poor to nutrient rich. And of course, so this is just a little bit about what's the drainage here. This is where all this sediment comes from. So it brings us also all this plant material from land. And but coming back on this nutrient-rich water, so this is the algal bloom that is triggered by the Amazon River, by the sediment plume. And so it's not only feeding the Western Amazon in sediment that's nutrient-rich, but it's also feeding the ocean with nutrient-rich water. So it's very important in that sense. It's also for the coastal environment, it's a very important transition. And you can see this this flow across, well, sort of in the westward direction of this fresh water, but also the sediment plume. And so one thing that we're looking currently at with researchers in Amsterdam and with Suriname University is to look how this has affected now the Guyana coast, and at which point in time did the Guyana coast transition from a sandy to a muddy coast, this muddy coast being derived from the onset of the Amazon River, or throughout the evolution of the Amazon River. We think that this is something that we need to find out, because at the onset, the Amazon River had a much lower sediment supply than it had, for instance, during the Quaternary, when Quaternary climatic fluctuations brought a manifold load of sediment into the coastal region. So the history is like stepwise, and so that's what we're trying to find out now. Yeah, this is just a figure that we used in a paper in 2010 to sum up the history of the Amazon. So by showing the species richness in plants, in terms of plant, using pollen as an indicator of diversity. That curve was produced by Carlos Jaramillo. And then we have summarized here, you can see this blue and yellow, that's representing the Pebas system, and you see the sort of rise and demise of this system through time. And then we get the sort of expansion of mammals, and that has all to do also with this connection with the closure of the Central American Seaway. And so it's like a sort of, in a nutshell, what happens across the Amazon, and also showing a bit of the lineages through time based on the data from the different organisms, and how some, of course, had a long history in the Amazon, and how some are related to this elevational gradient that starts, that develops, especially in the last 10 million years. And sort of a next step was to look to sort of resume, like, what do we think, how the forest changed through time. There's lots of gaps. One of the things we know very little about is what happens after this onset of the Amazon. The last 10 million years, there's hardly any record on land. So I think that would be one of the new frontiers for us still to discover. I know that there's Brazilian geologists looking into that and producing data, but it's very hard to find records between the last 10 and 100,000 years, 10 million years and 100,000 years. So that's something that we still will depend on the marine record, but we think there has been some very important changes. So thinking of what was the past. So we had this very rich past, very dynamic, lots of changes, this fluvial lacustrine system, this river system, that all would have affected the flora. But we also know that something like climate cooling, which started, especially the global cooling that started in the late Miocene at about 13 million years, will have affected the forest. And from the very little records that we have, we think it was a more open, again, a more open canopy forest, more depleted forest. But how exactly that looked, it looked like it was diminished in assemblage. But this is something we really need to find out more about. And this is work with my colleagues Lucia Lohman and Lydian Bosman and Fabienne Condamin, a summary that we made. And Fabienne Condamin also looked into some of the phylogenetic data from selected taxa, and also showing that, well, after this demise of the Pebas system, some of the terrestrial taxa, some of the plants at least, seem to have done well and seem to have diversified in this last, 10 million years. So more data always needed, of course, but this is a summary that we have based on the geological past and what it means for the vegetation. I, of course, have highlighted how important I think geology is and how it has transformed. I also would like to highlight these maps that have been produced this last year by our student Cecile Alsbach, and this is published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society. And and showing like what are these components of geodiversity, and how have the, for instance, the Andean rivers affected the region. How do they shape the region at present, but also how are the soils, how diverse are the soils, and the relation between soils and geodiversity. So what's next? So I mentioned already some of the things that we're working on, like trying to understand this composition of the mangroves. What was the composition then? What can we learn from that? How have the mangroves changed, the coastal mangroves? We want to know more about the coastal development, about the last 10 million years of the Amazon River. And one of the big steps that we hope are going to give us more insight is this core, this scientific core that has been drilled in the Acre Basin in the western Brazil. This is an international program. Many scientists are participating in this. This core was long delayed because of COVID and different technical problems, but it has been drilled. We have been able to sample, and so we hope these cores are going to give us more insight either into in the last 10 million years or maybe further back. We don't know at this moment what the age of the sediment is. It's more than 900 meters of sediment that has been drilled and recovered. So that's the sort of treasure that we hope, and this treasure chest we hope will provide us very new insights into the history, the deep time history. And so this is what it looked like sampling this. This was just in August in Minneapolis. So a big team of palynologists has been working. This is a collaboration between Amsterdam and Panama, the Smithsonian. And of course, many other geologists that are sampling for different disciplines, trying to date, trying to establish sediment source, etc. And so of course, I want to highlight what I said at the beginning, that the science panel is sort of trying to alert the wider community, the global community, of the threat of the human impact and how it's affecting, and how action should be taken and what kind of action should be taken, and that many papers have come out by collaborative work of people who are part of the network. And showing that 70% of the original forest has been cleared, about especially the worrying situation of the southeastern Amazon, and that sort of immediate action is needed, and also about how human impact is exceeding what we know from the natural processes over deep time. And so that's something that the science panel is very actively working on and making moves, making these policy briefs to advise policymakers through these assessment reports and the briefs. And so some of the recommendations that the panel has made are this: achieve zero deforestation by 2030, avoid forest degradation, and restore forests in protected areas, and sustainable restoration of degraded farmland. There's also, they provide, so you can find, I'm leaving this with you, so this is the site that you can consult for this network is the Amazon We Want. They also have training for students, online modules, and it's a great platform to learn more about knowledge from the Amazon and to keep informed. So that's what I had to say, and I would like to thank you very much for your attention.